a little bit of time left tonight, and I thought I'd use this time to set the horn into the trailing edge. So the first thing I needed to do is mark dead center on here, because the horn itself is offset a few thousandths so that the push rod is in the middle. See, the horn is not exactly in the middle. We want the push rod in the middle. So what I've done is mark that all off. And now the first thing is I need to put a notch in here as clearance for the horn. Very carefully measured the exact center. Measured from the center where my horn legs will be. See, what I want to make sure I have is that the horn legs are in the right spot relative to the center of the wing. This is offset a little bit so that the push rod is in the middle. So now I cut a little notch, just cut it in with a zoner saw. Now I need to notch out the back of this exactly on center. I'll do it with a center line and press these two little retainers right into the slot, and that'll give me a little impression of where I need to make a recess for the wire, because I want the center line of the wire to be right on the center line of the wing. I just put an impression from the wire. Now I need to, on center, very carefully just slot this. You can just take that rough slot, just open it up a little bit, but making sure that I keep it right on center. Now I have that just pressed in, just enough. There's no glue on it yet. And I've got the two legs equal. Get that out of the way. And I want to make sure I've got no bind in here. And the next thing, I just want to put one drop of CA on each side just to hold it in place. Kind of like a tack glue. Even after a drop or two of CA, I always want to make sure this is perfectly free before I go on to the next step. Next thing I want to do is lay a ruler across here and sight down the ruler and make sure I don't have the horn up or down. And that's like an alignment thing. The way to do this is just to take a straight edge, hold it on the horn, and look down the trailing edge. It looks like we have it in the center. I'm trying to do this with one eye shut. Okay. Now we can permanently attach this to the back of the wing. Put a nice thick bead of CA in here and run a little sandpaper behind here, make sure nothing's binding up. Now I'm ready to put on, and I always put on a little carbon fiber reinforcement here, even those probably would never break. I just like the idea of having that carbon fiber in there. Now, last thing I did was put a couple of strips of the thin carbon fiber on here, and that's all I'm going to get to do tonight. Tomorrow when I come down to shop, hook up the controls, but luckily, this is the important thing, that no glue got in there in the course of laying this out. This morning, first thing we got out of the mold, pulled out the Mike's First Cardinal fiberglass cowl. That looks like it's really going to be nice. And that really is the Cardinal. You can't get more Cardinal than that, that's for sure. Anyway, so, but the program with all molded stuff always, now we made this with 6 layers. We're going to make one today with 5 layers, because this is really overkill. This is, and I know we could make it lighter. This is not really heavy, but we know we can make it even lighter. Now, the only thing, there was a couple little defects up around the edge here. I don't know if you can see these right there. See that little? That you could easily fill that in. Now, you got 2 choices. If you want to fill that in while you're doing this, just make a little bit of that paste and stick it in there and then sand it out the next day. But even that, you don't even have to do that, because you can fill that with hot stuff very easily. I found just thick hot stuff works real well, and you can sand it instantly. You don't even have to wait. Anyway, you got the first one? You got all this cloth cut up? You got the silica? Okay. Make another cowl. Now this is the part we like, is that you can replicate them very quickly. Mold worked out real nice. And if anybody would like to borrow this mold, no problem at all. We'll work it out with you. Try to design a cowl. We try to design it with a square parting line, because then you can just dress it off on a belt sander. A standard kit has a little tang here, but we're going to improvise making a little bit different mounting system for this when we get to that point. Eventually get to this point where it comes right off. I just want to put the last final finish on this. Say you've got a unique model like Bob Gieske's Bear, for instance, and you want to make a cowling, and Mike Cook's going to have the same cowling, and Joe Blow's going to have the same cowling, and John Grigsby, and everybody's going to have the same cowling. Well, once that mold is made, nobody has to do the carbon anymore, and that's the nice part about doing this, is you not only save yourself all the work, you save everybody that's building that model all the work too. It's finishing up this custom stooge here, okay.
Because each leg is a little bit different in thickness, you just can't drill a hole through there.
Right, you got to plot the holes.
So you got to take this rod, stick it in there, make sure you got enough room. You don't want to be too high, because you won't have enough material here.
Now, if it's too high, here's what happens. This angle is now not less than 90, it's more than 90, and the plane is going to slide out.
It could break the top of this.
Yeah, so you want to have this to be a relatively, I see what Mike's doing, making a tight fit out of this. See, this is the part, like our friend Mr. Jacobin says, oh, I'll make one of those in a half an hour.
Yeah, well, go ahead.
Go ahead. Then I notice he has one of yours a week later. Yeah, okay. So you plotted the two spots for the holes.
Right. So that's where that's going to go.
And you know where they are, and then you're going to put a brass bushing in there.
Right.
But this is the part that's all carbon fiber and epoxy reinforced. This is the only part that I think if you ever, somebody stepped on it or something, they could break. You sure couldn't break the wood. Okay, you got to drill the holes, put the brass bushings in, and another happy stooge customer. Oh, we got the finish on it too.
Yeah. Before we put the finish on, we got to make the holes though.
Yeah, make the holes.
And we got to put a bushing in this.
Okay, and you got bushings for the wires.
Okay. This will be what you hook your
solder that on.
We got to put a bushing in that.
Okay.
This will go on here. This is just like a stop I put on.
Okay.
So when you slide it in, you push it all the way in, you make sure it's in all the way.
Right. But there's a lot of people think there's no thought, and if you look back, on a previous video, I put in a little bit of footage of the original one I made, and holy crow, when I look at this compared to that, get some level of appreciation for how much work goes into this. The thing Mike has, and I think this is a nice touch, he's got the pull wire with a bushing, a dead stop, a little connector for the line connectors, and a little rubber sleeve to cover the control line.
Yep.
That slides right in there.
Done.
And there it is, baby. I'm telling you, that's a work of art. Put the pipe. Oh, we got to put the finish on it yet.
Yeah. We're gonna put the finish on, then put the insulation on here.
Okay, 6-8 coats of.
Trim these off.
Custom made for Don Dixon.
And that one's ready. Ready for the field.
Oh, that looks good. All right, take the. Now, after looking at the cowling, the first pull from this mold, we made a couple of decisions. Number one, we think we're going to be able to do it in 5 layers of this cloth. We also had a couple little edges, so we need to address. So what I'm going to try to do is put some of the paste up in the edges, I'll lay this one up for Mike while he's finishing Stooges. Now, just for some people that might not know, Mike basically only makes Stooges once a year during the slow time of the construction. So if you're seeing this video in the middle of the summer, I guess you got to get on the list. And his list usually builds up all summer, and then he, in this next couple of weeks, will be taking care of as many orders as possible. Anyway, the idea of making more than 1 or 2 cowlings, we want to fine-tune it now. Now we know we're getting a nice pull from this mold. The next step here is going to be to maybe lighten it up a bit, which really is almost unnecessary. These are much lighter than wood would ever be, and certainly much stronger and durable. You can put your fingernails in them and everything. And I'm not going to put the whole layup on here. I just wanted to make the point that the advantage, see, when you carve a cowling, you make one, you really don't go back and make another one to see if you can make it better because it takes too long. When you're doing molding, you can always just go back and make another one. Once you get that tool or mold made, from this point on, it's only about 20 minutes to a half hour and the whole thing is done. As time goes by and we accumulate more and more of these, what we're doing, this one is 5 layers. If this one looks like we can lighten it up, we'll make one 4 layers. We'll drop it down until it gets to the point, there's obviously a point of no return where it gets a little too oil candy, but I think this is going to be a good one, and I think this is a mold we're going to ultimately make a lot of parts from. So it was worth doing a nice job on the prep on it. I sanded this all down, just so that the silk span will lay on in. I want to make sure I don't have any binding in here. Biggest single problem I've ever seen people have, especially new guys, is they wind up getting some of the glue in there, and this thing gets ratchety, and you never really get rid of that, no matter how. It takes maybe 100 flights to wear that out, especially if it's CA. Now, the most important thing I want to do right now, I want to get the bell crank in neutral, and I want to get the horn relative neutral, and I want to measure the amount of this push rod I have to cut off. Now, I have a nice little way of adjusting neutral here. It's very simple, and it works every time. Now, I have the push rod in neutral, flap horn in neutral. I want to allow about 1/4 inch for the wire bend. So by moving the tape, actually I could move the tape up just 1/16 of an inch, because I don't want to have the wire any longer than it has to be. And I can lay this out then, get an idea how much wire I need, and I can cut the push rod off the next step. This is a great way to line up neutral, by the way. This little trick works well. I was all set to say, don't let the wheel cut you. Hard to do this looking through a lens cap, believe me. Looks easy when you watch it on television. Whee! Anyway, how not to cut a push rod. Anyway, now we have our rough length. Now I need to make the little end with the wire on it and drill a little hole in here. Now I want to get a rough idea where this hole wants to be. It can be right about there. And notice what I'm doing. I'm making a hole a little bit egg-shaped. It's this egg shape that it's going to allow me to get a neutral really established before I set the push rod length. Gives me a very nice way to fine-tune it without rebending the wire. The one scenario you never want to have, and I mean for all the money in the world, make the push rod up, you bend the wire up, it's all up and not enough down, and you can't get neutral, so you rebend the wire. You never rebend wire, especially this K&S wire, this hobby shop wire. Once you bend it past 90 degrees and you bend it back, you've lost about 1/3 of the strength. So the trick is, I'm going to leave this little tang on here, I'm going to bend this, and then just slide this in and out to fine-tune neutral. And if I have to, at this point in time, I could just make a new piece of wire if I miss by an inch or something. So the next thing is to drill this out, make this little piece of wire. But it's this little egg-shaped slot, and we'll fill that with carbon fiber and epoxy later. Now, by having this piece in here, and of course, make sure that tang sticks up. Now, when I go to set my final neutral, I put the push rod through, I get this set exactly where I want neutral. And then I'll drop some epoxy down in there, I guess you could use CA, and I'll wrap this with carbon fiber. But it's having this little adjustment before you actually make the final commitment, rather than rebending the wire. That's really makes this whole system work well.
I get the set neutral by, I can look right in and see that the belt crank is in dead neutral. My flap horn is in dead neutral. And if it isn't, if I'm not happy with the setting, I can simply just move this just a little bit before I actually attach it permanently. A couple of drops of epoxy drying in there.
The next thing I do is make sure I have the same amount up as down, but most important is that that belt crank is in neutral when this is in neutral. And if it isn't, I can just heat the epoxy with a soldering iron right on the wire and move that a little bit still. As soon as that kicks off, dries up, I'm going to wrap this whole push rod end with carbon fiber, and then I'll set the retainer on. This is binding, and I'm trying to find any place it even comes close to binding before I solder this on, because then I can move it out of the way, of course. I don't want to take a chance that somewhere in the future this will start to bind a little bit. Little safety thing I always do is once I know I have no problem with push rod clearance, and I know I'm not even close, I like to seal the end of this with CA. Two reasons: if fuel or oil ever gets into the plane, it doesn't wick into this wood and destroy the glue joints, number one. Number two, if some freak thing happens, somebody picks up the plane, since this is a take-apart plane, they put their thumb here, they'll break it. So that having that in here is like a little safety thing. I've already got that in, I've got it sanded down. Now the next thing I want to do is, I always make my keepers, I put a slit. First thing, I grind a little notch in the wire. So then I put my washer or retainer on there, and then wrap copper wire around it. And this is the way I do all the permanent joints. This is going to be a permanent joint. The other one will be a wheel collar, a double wheel collar system, similar to Miss Ashley, but this is a permanent joint. Always stay bright solder, always defluxed with baking soda and water. Now, you don't want to go halfway through the wire, but you do want to get enough of a notch in there that it'll hold. And it's kind of a system for redundancy, so that no matter what happens, let's see if you can see this, once the copper wire goes on there, that's kind of a fail-safe system. And I can't tell you how many planes in the 45 years I've been doing this I've seen crash and this washer isn't on there, and they just use old rosin solder or plumbing solder or something. Stay Bright solder is the only solder to ever use on a model plane.
And this is Brodak wire, just lead-out wrapping wire, just wrapped on there. Twisted relatively tight, you don't have to snap it off. But the most important thing is that Stay Bright solder on the joint.
Kind of important because Stay Bright melts at 410 instead of 736. What happens, you don't melt this plastic part when you put a joint on here, and that's a significant good thing. Also, the Stay Bright has about, I think, 300 times the strength, but it is a corrosive. The flux has sulfuric acid in it, so the most important thing, when you're done, you need to get a mix of baking soda and water and deflux the joint. And it would be even more important on a plane that's not a take-apart, because you wouldn't see this joint if you leave even the slightest bit of that acid on there. This neutralizes the acid, and then I usually try to polish it up with a little bit of anything, really, sandpaper, 1200 sandpaper, anything, just to get whatever residue might still be on there. And then grease the joint with the same motorcycle lube that we use on the whole control system. And I mean, this, you can tell, this jar has been around for a while. Trust me, this jar has been around since I was flying fools. This is really, I've never, one thing of baking soda and water just literally lasts a lifetime. But you really have to, it's absolutely important that you deflux any stay-bright joint. Now one little drop of that motorcycle chain lube on here, and I think we're pretty much lubed for life. Now I'll double check that I have the same amount of up and down. I don't want, and because as soon as when I put the carbon fiber on this, then I'm married to the mob. I can't get out. If I found, for instance, now with all the adjustments, I didn't have enough up or enough down, I could just take this joint here, just take the Dremel, the little point in, and elongate that hole again. This is basically just tacked in position. All my controls are in neutral at the same time. I'm real satisfied with it. I have the CA. I'm just waiting for so it's ready to kick off now. Once it kicks off, you can just break the extra piece off. Here's a trick. Whenever you put the CA on here, of course you could wrap it around, hold this up because it wicks up less if you hold it down here. If you do this, it's going to wind up on your hand. Hold it up just like this, and usually you can just break it right off. And I'm going to sand this down just to make it a nice, clean, workmanlike joint. And we're ready to install the flaps. I just don't want to have any rough, these tend to be little razor blade edges up here. I can put a final coat of thin CA on this once it's all ground down. But I have seen these ends fail when they're not wrapped after a long life, and we're hoping we have, we're always hoping for long life. Before I installed, again, what I did, I weighed the two flaps, of course. The lighter of the two goes on the inside, the heavy one goes on the outside. And what I want to do, I want to set up, now there's a great little trick for doing this. If you put the tubing in the edge of the flap, the little aluminum tube first, and then go to slide it on, you'll notice it's always on a little bit of an angle, you never really get it right. Now my system is, and it's a really nice thing, is I take the tubing and attach it to the horn, just temporarily slide it on, and then while it's in place, I tack glue it. So any little amount that it's off is taken up for the fact that you've already got the tube in place. Now, of course, we'll start at pretty close to 90 degrees, exactly 90. It looks like it's not 90 because this little bit of material is off the horn. But the trick here is to cut the tubing first. Again, life is full of little tricks. Every trade, including making stooges, is loaded with little tricks. So the trick is to get a little piece of the tubing ready. Now, it's hard to believe, after all the snow we've had in the last couple of days, just when I thought we were getting over this, I see it snowing again. Oh boy, oh boy. See, now when it's snowing and you want to do some extra good modeling, here's the whole trick. Extra strong coffee. This is what's going to keep me up tonight. Look at this, 10:30, the phone is ringing. Oh, that coffee is, oh man, that's going to get me through this flap job. I'm back. As I always talk about time management, I mean, I had to leave this to go shovel and take care of business over at my rental property, but here's one of the neat things. In a very short time, I got one on here, I got to do the other one. Later on tonight, and I'm going to try to pull a late night thing here, because what I want to do is, I want to get to the point where I get a coat of dope on everything, and the dope is drying. Because, see, this is all time management. What's going to happen is tomorrow, I'm going to be going out to a friend's house, Jim Borelli, Basically, it's his daughter's birthday. We go out every year, and he's a modeler, so we enjoy seeing his new shop and seeing his things. But what I'm really going to try to put the push on tonight, and I'll stay up late tonight, this is just one of my little ploys, one of the ways I deal with things. I want to get the hinge pockets set in this, and I want to get that final shaping and sanding around the edges, the cap strips, and I'll make a little storyboard out of that later. But because we were interrupted with a snowstorm, I never got this. I wound up before, I didn't even get this on the video, I put my thumb through the plane. Anyway, a little of that old DAP, boy. Keep that DAP handy. I need to take the aluminum tubing first, recess this with a half moon kind of recess so that I can get the tubing on here, and that horn will ultimately set the angle of the tubing. So what I don't have is this or this. I have a relatively straight throw on that, and the best way I know to do that is just let the horn itself set the tubing in place. And don't put your thumb through the ring. See that? See, you think I don't do stuff like that? Forget it. That's why we have our friend vinyl spackling compact. It's true. Yep. It happens to everybody. And two kind of people in the world. People that they admit that it happens to them, and liars. One is to recess for the aluminum tubing. Now the aluminum tubing actually acts as a spar, which allows us to shorten the horn arm, and in effect have a hollow horn arm when this is all put together. It's actually a weight saving to have that in, as opposed to having a piece of wire. I've weighed it out both ways. The piece of wire you remove more than offsets the weight of the tubing. And it's stronger, and in the end we're going to put a cap on this with the grain going front to back, just as a reinforcement also. There's a lot of good ways to do this, but I always like to set this in, even if it's not a take-apart plane, into an aluminum tube. Make a little bit of an indentation. Just take a knife and do this for right now, so that the horn, this tubing can go as far forward on the flap horn, it'll go around the bend. Now this sets the length, and notice I've made it oversized, plenty long, because this is going to act, in essence, as a reinforcement as part of the horn. If you ended the horn here, you'd probably put a crack in a flap right where the horn ended. So having this aluminum tube actually acts as a little spar. And there's not many real easy ways to do this. And it doesn't have to be real fancy anyway. A nice thing to do is just take a piece of 1/8" tubing. The thickness of the sandpaper makes up for the thickness of the tube. You get a nice final fit on there. I don't want to take any more away than I have to. I don't want to have a real sloppy fit. The trick is here, as always, there's always a trick. Don't glue this in. Let's see if we can show this up on. I want to put the tubing on here, get it up as far as it will. We'll ultimately be grinding some of that away. Now I want to line up the hinge line accurately. And I just want to tack this in place, and I don't want to glue it. Just want to tack it. The reason for that is I don't want to take a chance that if I do this with thin CA, it's going to wind up gluing the whole thing to the horn. So I just let that kick off, then I'll have that tack glued in place. And once that kicks, see, that has actually set the tube in place. And now when I put it back, I have the hinge line exactly the way I want it. Now I can take this out and put a permanent glue seam in here. Now what I'm going to ultimately do is soak this whole area with several coats of thin CA just to reinforce it. This is just a piece of scrap And I pressed it down, so the little piece of the horn that's sticking out makes a little half moon in the scrap piece. Just press it down. While it's being pressed, run some thin CA down both sides. I'll let that kick off. Okay, just got that roughed off with a knife, and I'm going to sand the rest of this in, and then take that little notch out. There'll be a little notch missing so that the horn wire can get in there. I have to make that little trough for where the horn is going to enter in there. Now I'm going to put several coats of thin CA right along this whole band so that I have this and go in maybe 3/8 of an inch. So this whole edge of the wood is relatively hard. Now what I did, I made these pieces a little bit bigger than I thought they should be because I want to, if I decide to put a fillet in here or if this comes close to the fuselage, I want to have extra little material in there. This will probably ultimately get trimmed off either to match a fillet or to match the fuselage side depending on how we do that. That CA really hardens things up. We got 3 coats, sand each coat. One of those tricks worth its weight in gold. Before you go to put it back on, I run the exact drill size, which is the idea of the tubing. So if there's any, and once in a while there is some, in fact this you can see it's still on there. I don't want to have is to push this on the horn and have it lock up. It may seem like I'm paranoid about these lockups, but the first time you ruin a flap or a wing or something, I think you'll see where I'm coming from. Anyway, that's cheap insurance. Now we know we're going to have a nice fit. We have the little recess and 3 coats of CA on all areas here. This is nice and rigid now. We're ready to do hinge pockets. Ready to do hinges. One really final thought, if there is a little restriction and you go to put this on and it doesn't slide right on, one of the things don't be even thinking about doing is putting this in a drill and putting it in a drill press. As soon as that drill catches that CA, it breaks the end of the flap off. So what I like to do if I'm not happy, again, if I have a little bit of that, and it's almost inevitable that you get some of that CA down in there, work it with a drill by hand or in a pair of pliers, but never in a powered drill where it's turning and it can grab. It's probably still going to have a little bit of that in there. Yeah, see, even now we got a little bit in there. But rather than run to the drill press, this is a whole lot better of a choice, is just do it by hand. Yeah, there's still some stuff in there, but this is what really happens. You know, the problem is we all live in a real world. Speaking of real world, I heard from Walt Brownell today in a nice letter that he's building his own version of the Typhoon. A little bit different than mine, but certainly knowing Walt, it'll probably be more scale than mine. And we hope he's going to send us some pictures. Some result of all this work is once these parts are fit, this is really as nice as it gets. And we got a nice straight, tight hinge line. And also, when you have the hinge line not lined up, it kind of puts a bind into things. Now, I also want to sight down here and make sure I don't have one level or not the other. But another nice advantage of a take-apart plane, if you needed to tweak the flap horn, you can take this off. You don't have to tweak with the flaps on. You can do all your tweaking with the flaps off. That's just one more nice advantage of, and I've been trying to evaluate it over the last couple of years, but it seems like take-apart planes always have more advantages than disadvantages. Now, it turns out the horn lined up real nice without a tweak, but sometimes you need a little tweak. I'd want them to be perfect. I'll check them again after I do the hinges. The first thing I want to do here, I want to trim. Now, I was going to. See, I had thought of this. I was going to trim this back here and put the end piece with the grain going this way, and I thought, well, I just didn't want to see the seam, number one. That was one thing. So, but that, if you were using real punk wood, now it turns out this wood is really heavy. This is probably 9 or 10 pound wood. So I'm going to go with the idea of just trimming this off. I have a pattern for this. Trimming this off and then blending this in. Once I get the final hinging in, I'll get the final blend on all this.
is a good little trick too. I leave a little bit of material on, oversized, because once I actually put the hinges in, then I'll do a final sweep of this and I'll check it with the template, of course. But I don't want to do this final shaping until I actually get the hinges in place. I just want to remove this extra material. Sometimes I'd make a tip, and what would happen on a tip, and by the way, Walt Brownell is telling me he's got 5.5-inch tips. Ooh, is that going to be thicker like a Thunderbird? I mean, there is a compromise here. This is not exactly totally scale, but I just didn't want to have it and turn it into a Thunderbird either. We just got our first smoothie kits in. They're out and they're ready if anybody's doing up a nostalgia plane. Brodak smoothie kits. They're in stock now. Well, I want to clear the table off, get the things ready for the hinging, but we're trying to put the push on so we can get some dope on this. I just wanted to lay it out, check that I like the look of the flaps, the way that the tips, they're going to blend in. We get the final blending in again after the horn is installed, after the hinges are installed. Can't imagine Walt Brownell, 5.5-inch tips. I'm just thinking about that. Woo! Walt, I can't wait to see some pictures of your plane. And Walt, by the way, is a competent, very competent scale flyer. And I imagine he's thinking he possibly could retrofit that Zetron guy in there. I don't know. We'll find out. This little gizmo that Bob Martens, I still have the original note from it that we came up with for cutting hinge slots. It's just one of many good ways to do it. I also bought a router table, but I found this system to be more practical. And there's nothing real fancy about this, but it's a great little invention. 2 little pieces of motor mounts, and you can see what it's actually doing. I hang up the cable so that it's resting, and it's got a little bit of slack in it. Now, it's not a tight fit. It's a very loose fit, so I can do a final adjustment before I tighten the screws. So I need to set the height here, and this was all Bob Martens's ideas. This works so nice because all the hinge pockets are in straight. You don't have them all on crazy angles and everything. And there's nothing special about it. Like I said, I have the little Dremel router table, which works well too. But this was just so easy and basically free. Everybody has chunks of motor mounts and just an edge of a table. Little part that makes this work, and this was Bob Martens's invention. It's a little dead stop, so you can't cut the hinge pockets too deep. So what I do, I just tack glue this down to the table, a couple of drops of CA, and then I have to set my height gauge, how high I want that to go, and of course I just loosen the screws, raise this and lower it, and then run a test to see if my hinge pockets are in the center or not in the center. And of course I have a wheel that's worn down to exactly the size of a hinge. First thing, I have a piece of scrap, of course, and I want to see if I'm set accurately. The way I know I'm accurate is if I cut a slot and then flip the piece over, and it goes right in the slot. That looks pretty close anyway. A couple of thousandths more, then I just tighten up the screws here. You know, I know where that's going to be. And it's a good idea, just wear one of these fiber wheels down until it's the width of an IM hinge. In this case, we're using it, boy. See, now that fits right into the hinge pocket. When I flip it over, tighten these up. I don't want to run a machine. Okay, just double check again. I haven't moved it. Now, if you're really fussy, you can set up a little piece of wood on this edge, which I think I'll do with some CA, just to hold the piece from bowing over. But for all purposes, it's accurate enough when you just eyeball it. as he sticks his hand in a hinge machine. See, now I'm a little bit out of adjustment here because this bolt is, ow, it's hot. Woo! That's about as nice a hinge pocket as I think you can cut, and it's accurate and it's right on center. And the nicest thing, this little gizmo you make up with pieces of scrap plywood, it's basically a free tool. This is how nice this little tool is, because I don't want to get too deep. Yeah, I'm touching on the bolt. Don't burn yourself, dummy. I'm taking a little piece of shim. This is just a piece of scrap balsa shim. And just tack glue it on. And then I'll run another test to see. I don't want to pick up the edge of the bolt in there. We're dead on center. We haven't picked up that little ridge from the bolt. And we're going to trim the hinges off so we have a perfect fit. If I wanted to, I could push it the rest of the way in. I think that's really the nicest way I've known to put in hinge pockets. Not hinge pockets, the hinge slots.
Next thing I did, I made up this little tool to cut the hinge, the little pockets. Now they're actually half pockets. If we were doing a no-take-apart plane, this part would be about a 1/16 thicker because the hinge would sit back into the pocket. But by having the take-apart with the wire going through, I want half of the hinge in the flap and half in the back of the wing, so it's a half and half thing. So I've come up with this little gauge. It's a 64th plywood, some 80 grit sandpaper, and this holds this in place. Allows me to cut the pockets. And you can see I've got them marked off. They're 5.5 inches apart. So I want the pockets cut, the hinge pockets cut, and I'll re-put that center line back in there before I actually cut them. Now what I always do is I put these on kind of by eye and then I check them with a ruler. It's just a good guide when I'm working on that little hinge slotter. One of the jobs most new guys in our club and new guys that I've tried to work with, when they try using those tools with like knives with hooks on the end, and they try doing all these awful things, and then the flaps pucker up to 3 times the size, or when you buff it out you get these puckers in them. I think this way is just the easiest and the best at the same time. Yeah, I still check because I have sanded these and they are a tad thinner. So I need to make a little adjustment here, just a slight adjustment. This is probably a 64th thinner, so it's always good, again, to just line this up and see. Let me see, a 64th plywood. Now, that's real easy to do. I can just take a piece of 64th plywood, lay it on here, or I can lower this. I have 2 adjustments. I can raise the table or lower the blade. And every one, and when I do the wing, it'll be the same way. I'll make sure I have the correct adjustment there, and then you double check on this is just check it with your eye, with your naked eye. You can do this in thousands. Okay, so we'll cut one here and just see. Turning it over, I know I have it right on center. Don't have to deal with those hinge pockets and a warp trailing edge, anything that's about the best way I know to get some nice, accurate. It seems like the 5 or 10 minutes you spend setting this up and making it and adjusting, when you have all those hinges in a line and the controls are really nice, and it's especially helpful when you have a take-apart plane, because then that wire goes right through the hinges instead of each one going up and down the stairs. There's one final test, and that is to look right down the hinges, eyeball them right up. We also, because we're replicating this system, we have to put half of the hinge pocket in the trailing edge of the ring, half in the flap, rather than the whole thing, because the reason is I want to be able to slide that wire. If you don't have to slide the wire, of course, very easy. Or if you were willing to put a channel or something in the trailing edge, it's just easier to do it this way. And that way, since the reason this has worked so well, when things work real well, I'm prone not to want to reinvent them. There's so many things on Miss Ashley that are going into this plane, and we'll try to take all the good features out of it and not reinvent any of the good ones. The thought, since we put so much time into making this wing perfectly straight, then to have a crooked hinge line is just going to really be frustrating. Huh? I want to put a center line on this now because I need to put the little hinge pockets, I'll do that off camera, the little hinge pockets, and line them up with the flaps so that they marry right in. The flap sets the little hinge pocket in the trailing edge of the wing. I always put the center line on pretty much by hand, and then I check it with my long ruler. This is the kind of thing, if you had Mike, well, Mike's out there grinding away on his stooges outside in the snow. A lot of the sanding on his stooges is really dust intensive. That oak really makes some nasty dust. Anyway, this is going to allow us, once I get this finalized and I get my straight reference line, the way that snow is coming down out there, it doesn't look like I'm going to get any dope on this tonight, but I'll try to get the hinges on. But just try to get some idea of... Now, I want to check this, needless to say, check it with a straight ruler. Even though I have that sketched on, I like to check it with a straight edge, especially out at the tip. Okay, looks good. Now, next thing is to let's make sure we have the right one on here. Lay these in place and transpose these hinge pockets into the other side, and then see, I'm getting ahead of myself here. All I'm thinking about is that shoveling snow tonight. It's me so aggravated. Each one of these hinges, I know I have to put a hinge pocket. Well, tip, maybe I haven't put this on the video in a while. A lot of times you're trying to hold a ruler on a trailing edge of the wing, and when you're alone, you need a third or a fourth or a fifth hand. But what I've done many times when Mike isn't here is I just try to get this ruler lined up and hold it on when it's on center with a couple of pieces of tape, and that can just let me check that my end hinge pocket is true. That little piece of tape, one of the good little tricks that you can use over and over again, just use the tape as the third hand. This I have to kind of guide by hand. That's just about how, well, it's exactly the same as Miss Ashley said. I know that the wire will have no problem, we'll have no trouble getting that wire in there. Again, you can't put the hinges back into the flaps because then you can't get the wire around it unless you make some kind of really convoluted thing up there. Anyway, the last step here, well, one step is I want to line and see if the two flaps are in alignment. I guess you can see that's real good. It's a lot more a factor of luck than anything else. Now, we had couple little things I wanted to sand in the tips, and it does not look like we're going to get dope on this tonight. See, I left them oversized. Now with the piece actually in here, now I can sand that last little edge on there. Also, what I want to do is I run my hand down here to make sure I don't have any high spots. Or you can feel, actually, if it's wrong, as well as looking at it. You can look right down the trailing edge and see if you have any spots that just don't seem to match up. And if you do, this is a good time to true them up. Get the sanding block to go over to both parts at the same time. Get rid of the high spots. And it looks like all I'm going to get done tonight. Again, sadly, the snow has won the battle. I found out you can only shovel so much snow and it's still coming down. We wanted to go out to Borelli's. I don't know if we're going to care. Well, we may postpone it a day or so. Talk about time management. Today is a good example of a day that I really would have liked to get a lot more things done. But 2 sessions with the shovel, just about when you're 55, believe me, 1 session's enough. So what I'll settle for doing here is just sand out the last little bit of this wing, and tomorrow come back loaded up with energy. And then I want to do a final sanding. I want to put a little storyboard. Maybe at the end of this night I'll put a little storyboard of what my technique for doing that is. Boy, this is so important to get these tips right. How many times I've seen them and then they're just not right and it jumps right out at you that something's wrong. But I know when I'm tired and a lot of snow shoveling and I'm not going to do my best work, and whenever I'm doing any modeling, I really like to do the best I possibly can. And once I get the shape, now I need to get that. That's pretty much the shape I want. I want to get the center line on there. I can start tapering down into that. This is the part that it just takes a little time to get the blend just right. Work right up to the center line. I took a gram scale reading. It's, let's see, 319. Let me divide that up. It's 11.3 in rearwood. And that includes all the hinges, all the tip weight boxes. 11.3 is, well, I guess average. Happy about it. I seem to have fudged the tip shape. When I look at the real pictures of the real plane, I guess Walt Brownell's is going to be a little more scale. But anyway, there's a package delivery. You believe these people? Now we're at the point with this wing, even though we tried to get this done expediently. There's a time, and that time is right now when we really have to go into slow motion. And there's a lot of areas, and these are possibly the areas that I could sand with a sanding block. Maybe the sheeting around here. This could all be done with a sanding block. I wanted to make this point because this is really a good one. But there's certain things that you really can't sand with a sanding block. You need to sand by hand. Because what happens if you don't, you sand this with a sanding block, you wind up making the sheeting at the ribs very thin. And of course the final sanding on all the radiuses and round edges, and I was real happy the way this Typhoon, it really does look semi-scale. I hope Walt Brownell's not jealous. Anyway, but we have something that's very, very significant is after we get this, and we will do this tomorrow, we will do all this final sanding with 320 or 400, get this velvety smooth, and then we have one final little thing we have to do. This is one of the things that, in all of the finishing that you do, it's probably one of the most important steps, is to radius any edge where there'll be an open bay and the wood ends and the silk span begins. Every one of these radiuses, and let me explain to you what happens, because a lot of times you don't think, you think, see here in your mind what you think is happening isn't really happening. In your mind you're thinking, well, this is just going to be a flat line, like you could lay a ruler right over here and this would be a straight line. But it's not. What happens is tissue shrinks from corner to corner. And if you look at an I-beam wing from the front, it looks like the waves on a boat, because the tissue is shrinking corner to corner. That's what's really happening, and that's why you see all these vulnerable little high spots. Well, on a D-tube wing like we have, if you're going to sand through, this is where you're going to sand through. So we're going to be real careful. This is going to be a very time-consuming thing, and that's why I've kind of segregated it into a separate day. I do have a little time left tonight, but I know I don't have enough time to do it, and I want to do it all in one session. Exaggerated form, what's happening when you connect, when the tissue shrinks, it shrinks to form a straight line. And what happens, that straight line in the center is lower than it is at the cap strip. So when you look from the front, here's a cap strip, here's a cap strip. Just go look at any built-up wing. It tends to look like that. But what that does, the thing that's bad about it, is right here and here you have a vulnerable area where it tends to either sand through, or the tissue touch, or you break through or buff through. And that's why it's extremely important, anywhere there's going to be an edge, to get a radius. And we're going to spend, like I said, I'm going to try to dedicate a whole session, and once I get started doing this, I like to do it all in one session. I don't like to leave it in the middle, because where those little sagging ends edge, that's where you always get either a tissue ripping, sand through, or a buff through. We start with raw wood. Here's what really happens. You sand it down flat. It's 320 or 400, and you think, oh boy, smooth as velvet. Well, what happens now, you put on a coat of dope, 50-50, and what happens, the dope swells the wood cells. Wood cells swell and shrink, and now that once totally flat area now has some mountaintops. So after 2 or 3 or 4 coats, and we usually put between 4 and 5 coats on, what I like to do is sand it. Because any of these high spots I want to knock down again. Now we have a really flat surface. Now you're probably saying, well, why not just put the dope on the crooked wood and then sand it? Well, because what would happen is you'd have spots that had no dope on them. See, so you can't really outsmart yourself on this. You can't really leave out a step, even though you think you can, even though I thought many times I could. But once you sand out a surface that's been swollen and relaxed, now you pretty much have a good base. And now once this is tissued over, and I like to use medium paper, now once you have this, you should have the basis of a good base coat. Maybe 3 to 5 more coats of Brodak dope, and you have a substrate. Now that substrate should be relatively flat. If there are any imperfections, we can fix it with that little 3M. Let's say there's a little imperfection. We can use the DAP vinyl. And if you do like I just did, put your thumb through the wing, well, you can kind of fix it. But when we get to this point, then we're ready for our primer, silver, filler, whatever we're going to evolve into at that point. But it's these first critical steps, up to the point that the silk span is shrunken and the wood is swollen and then back down to its flat form, block sanded out. Right in here, many times what I've done is sand just a little bit after every coat. Now when time is not of the essence, As an example, if you were laid off from work and you have all day to sit around, you could do this. You could take the raw wood, and every time you put a coat of dope on, just lightly sand. Put another coat, lightly sand. You wouldn't have to wait for 3 coats. Yeah, that would be fine, but it'd be very time-consuming. But I think it's safe to say that if you put 3 to 5 coats on, and then take your time and sand it out, it would be pretty much ready for the silk spanning. And once that silk spanning has 3 to 5 coats on, another sanding. And again, you can get into this. Some of the planes I've had, I've sanded them out 3, 4, 5 times, because what I was trying to do is get everything, I call it beating it down. Beat down all the wood grain and beat down all the little imperfections. And I'd wind up at the end with a really nice flat substrate. And then from that substrate, I could put my filler coats on, I could put my silver on, my colored paint, whatever. But it's this base. This is the foundation of the house. And if you get this part good and flat, you are in great shape. And these are a couple of don'ts. These are things that I've tried over the years as shortcuts, and I did not have good luck with them. And that's using less thinner. What I tried to do at one time is use like 1/3 thinner, so that I would build that substrate up and it wouldn't go down into the wood cells and swell everything up. Well, the problem with that is you lose adhesion. So you gain on one end, but then you lose on the other end. So I would say never, especially with Brodak dope, never go less than 50-50 thinner. The other thing is never mix. Now I hope we're coming up on the year. In the first year we had virtually every day a call from somebody, oh, I still have a gallon of brand this or brand that thinner and I want to use it up. Can I, but little by little everybody's basically used that up, and I don't see anybody buying any more of it. So let's hope the day's going to come when that won't even be a question. All Brodak. If you go with all Brodak, first off, you're going to save money because you need less material. And you'll have that guarantee, that absolute guarantee, that halfway through it's not going to turn into an alligator or a leopard or something. It's cheap insurance. That advice from Wendy. I put 3 years of my life into working with all Brodak finishing materials. It's the only material I use now in the shop, and I try anybody that's come across a problem, I've tried to accumulate little fixes for the things people have done, and there are some people that have managed to try. Number one, there's somebody, I'll not mention his name, who had put no thinner in the paint at all and was having a lot of trouble spraying it. Well, you can't help everybody. That's the whole problem. I'm here try to help people, and if you can convince them to go with all Brodak, it almost guarantees they're going to have good luck, they're going to save money, and they're going to enjoy the process because it's going to work. It's not going to turn into something crazy, and then you're not going to have that mix and match thing going on. And this was one of my prototype ships, and that finish is now going on a year old. Not a scratch in the paint, no alligator skins, no delaminations, and the big one, and this is the big one that slips by a lot of people, does not have to be rebuffed. You look at some other brands of finish, when they're a year old, you know what? You have to rebuff them. This material doesn't have to be rebuffed, so I'm going to be going on the Typhoon, 100% Brodak finish. I got a couple of cute little things I want to improvise and try. We'll talk about them when we get down to that step. When I refinished this plane, I thought I was going to be real cute. I used acrylic lacquer car paint. And I said, wow, it buffed up beautifully. Oh boy, oh wow, front load plane. And you know what? Within a year, every cap strip cracked to the point when I saw the model this year, and of course now it's, it's going on 12 years old. Everywhere there's a cap strip, there's a strip of Scotch tape. Good lesson. See, if that was Brodak dope, it'd be perfect. What I'm going to try to do, I'm getting myself real comfortable, get a nice cup of coffee this morning, because this is going to be the final sand out before I put dope on here. And the first thing, I always like to try to do all the flat areas first with a long sanding block. Anything that's perfectly flat, and I know I'm going to work on, I want to maintain that totally flat surface. I'm not going to be able to use the block on the leading edge. I'm going to have to kind of do that by hand, but it's the easiest part of the job to do all the flat surfaces first. And this is very time consuming. I really wanted to do this last night. We wanted to go out to Jimmy Borelli's. That isn't going to happen with all the snow out there. So we've kind of decided to make a low-key weekend out of it. And actually it's good because it'll give me time to detail sand this out. But the first part, especially the flaps, having that nice where it reflects the light all in one shot. A big giant part of that is just having everything that should be flat. And before I put any dope on there, to have everything really, really nice and smooth. This I'm finding, because, excuse me, this is the part that just takes a lot of time, is getting all these little areas with the vinyl DAP. And if you don't fix them now, what happens? They show up through the coats of filler. And while I'm sanding it, it's a lot easier for me to do this by hand than by trying to do it with, looking at it or something. Looking at it, you see only part of it. Any little spot that I can fill in now with the vinyl, I'm just that much further ahead of the game. Actually, these don't look too bad. But I always wind up with a few fingernails and a few buttonholes, and here's a little spot up here I didn't get yet. The vinyl is, by the time, and I'll put this up by a heating vent, by the time I get done sanding one piece out, the next one will be ready. And I can flip-flop back and forth. I won't be wasting a lot of time. And depending on how long this takes, we may even get the first coat of clear on this today. But this is a step I don't like to rush. I don't like to set an artificial goal and hope I'm going to be done in a couple hours. This part just always winds up taking more time than you think. You can see how many little spots I have even on this piece, and as I'm going along I always find more. Now usually the part will get a little bit lighter after I do these fillings, because I'm going to sand the wood around it down. Now this is another part that right at the very end here, I'm trying to use my hand more than my eye and find any little spots that aren't just right. As I'm going down, I'm rubbing each cap strip, each little corner and edge, because if they're wrong now, after you dope them, they're going to be even worse. And I'll save the last step for sanding out all those edges of the cap strips. I have to make a couple little sanding blocks for that. The one thing you don't want to do is start rubbing a block on a leading edge, or you wind up with all those thin spots. That leading edge I have to do strictly with sandpaper in my hand. The padded table always works nice. Another trick you can use if, like I'm working alone, but it's not a big deal today, is you can lay a couple of towels or blankets on one end of the wing and one on the other tip, and then you can use both hands on the block. But for right now, this will be fine. And I've seen a lot of people that this is one of the steps they go. They try to do the whole thing in an hour, and yeah, they do. And then they add 20 hours into the sanding and a filler and a silver and whatever. And because these videos are going to go on to be the new Brodak finishing videos, I don't want to compromise them and come up with a less than the best finish I possibly can do. Now, there's no substitute There just isn't. I wish there was, for doing all this by hand. And you'll always find, as I said, sometimes you don't find it. Ah, there's one right there. Now when I find a low one like this, then instead of using the block this way, I'll turn the block on an angle. What it means is I have a little spot there that I just, right there, I want to kill it. And we've been trying to use our time management to maximize this winter, which has been brutal. And so far, I guess we're kind of catching up here, but I'm certainly not as far along as years ago, when the business was smaller. And thanks to the internet, we have a lot more business than we've ever had, which can be good and could be bad. Now again, there's just no substitute for checking these by hand every time you do it. A block like this is always good. What I try to do is, a lot of times if you do this by hand, you'll leave all the corners sharp. So I'm real careful to get that block right up into the corner with each one of these open bays. It takes a minute or so to do each bay, but to get that radius. And then of course the last thing, feel it. Feel for a sharp spot. This radius here, same thing, right up into the corner. This radius here, right up into the corner. Now this, like I said, this is going to take the better part of today to do this final sanding and filling in with the DAP and filling spots where I put my finger through the wing and everything. But we'll get another cup of coffee going, get some good videos on. See, this is the kind of thing you can actually do while you can actually watch tapes while you're doing this. Make sure each cap strip is blended in. The leading edge, there's really no other way to do the leading edge than just that I know of. Piece of sticky back paper. And I want to be sure that I don't make the leading edge, I don't want to take any material off that I don't have to on the leading edge. I don't want to make the leading edge a 32nd of an inch. I want to do the minimum amount of sanding until I get it nice and velvety smooth. Actually, the last time I'm going to have a chance to physically change the shape. So what I do is I take my hand and rub it down. I want to feel just that smooth, any little thing here has to be corrected now, because once the dope is on it, then I'm going to be sanding through and I'll have dry spots. So no matter how long this takes right now, it's a good investment doing this now, as opposed to, it's like pay me now or pay me later. Do an oil change or later replace the engine. One of the things that I just really believe in is always when you start a new model, use new cans of dope, and these are things that we've just opened up recently. Even though everything in this shop looks 100 years old. But I want to mix up a small amount, maybe half a pint or so of 50-50. I don't have to be exact. I don't have to make myself crazy here to get it exact. This is going to be the base coat. And each coat I put on from this point on will be a little bit thinner. Another thing I always do is mark which is which. In this case, this is going to be the Typhoon paint. It's a 50-50 mix. And I'm setting it up for the brush. And because it's really cold outside, we've had some significant cold weather here. I have to pretty much do this outside. And this will take longer to dry than normal. Give an idea what some of the conditions are out here, and you can't really see the cold in the video, but it is starting to melt, so it must have snuck up over 30 degrees here. I don't know. I'm going to get hopefully 3 coats on this, maybe an hour, 2 hours apart, depending on how long it takes to dry. Again, it's warmed up a little this afternoon. We're on the 3rd coat. I'm going to put 4 coats on this just to make sure. You see the temperature it is out here? It's really cold. And I've been trying to make sure I get that good bond. The longer things take to dry, the longer dope takes to dry, generally the better the bond will be, but obviously there's a point where, I think we're at the point right now, somewhere in this really cold. But I always like to know what that limit is. Now what we're going to do then is let this dry overnight. Out in the cold garage here, it may not even be dry in one day. It may take 2 days. But then a thorough sanding again, 400, 320. Knocking down any of the rough edges, and I've seen a couple of them that I missed. It's amazing how good things look when you look under fluorescent lights and you take it out in the sun and you see things you never saw before. The idea is to build up just enough dope on here so that we have adhesion, and if you have a little bit too much, it's nowhere near as big a problem as if you don't have enough. But when you don't have enough, and you go to pull a tape up, a lot of times you have a possibility of pulling. I'm sure everybody's done that. Anybody that's built models for any length of time. In this case, I'll play it safe with the insurance, just give it the 4th coat, even though I think this would probably do it. And it's certainly better to put on a lot of thin coats than one thick coat. Anyway, if you don't live in a part of the country where you get these radical snow events, I don't think you know what you're missing. One thought, one of the places I always try to get a little bit of extra finish is up on a leading edge, because that really does take a beating in terms of people launching a plane and just in general holding it and wiping it off and everything. Another thing, as the plane flies and it comes in and passes the judges, it reflects light off that bar at leading edge. And if that's really doesn't look as good as if it's one thing, one reflection. Hey, I'm looking at this spot here. This is funny where I stuck my thumb through it. But anyway, repairs up nicely with the DAP. The vinyl, a little extra on that. I look around, any extra spots where I think I'm going to need, and then I'll need some material, and then the last thing is I'll just coat the whole wing. I always get the first coat on. This leading edge is going to definitely take a lot of wear and tear in the course of the life of the plane. Just like the leading edge of the tail, another spot. One of the things I'm trying to avoid is getting a run in this because everything is so cold. I'm going to guess that this is going to take about at least 2 days in this cold. But next step is let everything dry up. Don't try to sand soft dope. Now take a little break here. Today we have some real interesting stuff in the mail. I wish I felt better. Too many hours out in that cold garage the other day. Anyway, for anybody who doesn't remember, this is a 1976 magazine, and I'm on the cover of it with this custom motorcycle that I did the custom painting on. I made the tune pipes, some of the fiberglass parts, the paint jobs, some of the custom parts. The fiberglass stuff came from England. But yes, that really is me. Trust me, that is me. And of course the magazine put a real nice article. A motorcycle magazine doesn't have construction articles. It has, I don't know, personality articles or whatever they are. But that was a long time ago. And I got a really valid point to make here. I'm looking at some of the stuff. See if you look at the, see that? Look at that, Wendy's racetrack experience. If they only knew. It shows you how easy it is to fool the editors of these magazines. Anyway, some of the custom stuff I had done, mostly the paintwork. But here's the point I wanted to make, the exhaust system. That was a lot of work. But here, now this you have to remember, this is the cool part of this. This is 1976. This is 25 years ago, whether you like it or not. But there's a method to my madness here. And this is from my friend Bobby Hunt, and I mean, we have been friends. We go back to motorcycle racing before we ever built model planes. We used to race motorcycles and fool with them and fall off them. Anyway, Bobby's been corresponding with me, downloaded some stuff from, this is the latest Suzuki Road Racer. I'm assuming this is somewhere around 10 grand. It's a lot of money anyway, it's out of my league. And of course I still have my original bike, my 82 bike. But now isn't this just something special in the world of model planes, how we've stayed together all these years building and flying and whatever. Both written flying models, columns, both done all kinds of, I don't know, experimental fun stuff. But here we are, we're grown, well, I'll speak for myself. We're supposedly grown men, and we're back to riding motorcycles. Well, he's riding. But anyway, what we've done is made a commitment that in the springtime, we're going to get together for at least one long ride with now here's a Suzuki just like mine too. It's nice that he downloaded all this stuff. And this is one of the hot, oh, look at the price here. 10.8. Make that 11,000. See what's nice about model planes in my book too? And I love motorcycles still, believe me, but this is the part of motorcycles that I think is, well, just not for me and Karen anymore. We like real estate, as terrible as it is. But anyway, now just go think to yourself, how many other hobbies in the world you stay with people, lifelong friendships, and years later. And it's funny now, I had nothing to do with this article when the guy wrote this article, but he came up with this name and it's become a classic. And of course the name of my big plane was the Sweeper, and he named this Street Sweeper. Can you imagine that? Anyway, just a nice little sidebar to today's, and I'm glad to see Bobby's back involved in it, because we'll get to go for a couple of rides, and a couple of our other friends, Mike Rogers and Andy Lee, they still have motorcycles too, so coming up this spring you may see some wild action as we all become boys again. Men become boys, boys to men, I don't know. We're going to do something. I'm just getting ready to watch this too. This is another video I have from Al Rabe. Al's got some trick stuff that he's graciously shared with us. Well, he's been calling once in a while. We've been really having some good times talking about his now under construction P-51. Needless to say, if anybody is interested in a copy of this video, they can just contact Al direct or get permission from him to borrow my copy. It's interesting stuff, to say the least. Stuff that really interests me anyway. Before I do anything, I have to decide today, because we really have a rarity today. It's not going to snow. I want to just dust, and I mean just dust lightly, not a thorough sanding, because we really can't change the shape of things much anymore. I just want to get any of the little high spots off of these. But when I'm done, I want to feel that I still have some dope on there, or enough dope, that when I go to put the tissue on these parts, there'll be enough dope underneath to make the tissue stick. Ever in doubt, one of the key little ways to figure this out is do the little parts. So what I'll do is I'll take one of these little parts and just do a quick little test before I set up, because if I need another coat of dope on this, I'd like to get it on today and let it dry. it'll dry real nicely out there too if it doesn't snow. See, they promise you it doesn't snow, and then it snows. But that's basically how I'd like it, is like a nice, soft, powders off. There's no chewing gum on the sandpaper, it powders off. And still leaving enough dope on here that I know I can get the tissue to get a good bond. Been watching Al's video, and Al's got some great ideas as far as jigging things up. And just being able to share it with the video, think how significant that is. If you had to do a magazine article showing how to build a Mustang wing, and he's showing how he has his jig set up with the dihedral blocks, the ribs, a lot of interesting stuff. Really interesting stuff. And I'm so glad Al is putting some of this stuff on video, because I know there are several other people, including myself, that really like his stuff. And every time I watch something like this, I always get another idea. And I'm sure if Al watches some of my stuff, he'll get an idea. And by sharing the ideas, both of us have more fun out of the hobby. Anyway, I want to get this, the objective here. I want to finish the wing. Just a light dusting, even on a flat. Now, you don't want to sand down the bare wood. That's not the objective. You want to just get the dust, the little high spots, the little rough edges off, in by the hinge pockets around the edges. I don't want to have anything that when the silk span goes over it is either going to be a bump or a valley. And I'll run around with the vinyl, see if I need any little spots filled with the vinyl. Because I'm really thinking and hoping that I'm going to be able to get the tissue on this today. I detail a wing, and this part of it is just very time consuming. And from this point on, every time I sand anything, coat of dope, the most important thing is to get the edges sanded. There's nothing worse than in the end of a paint job, you get all clear on a plane or whatever, and you sand through, and up comes this razor edge, this little spot that you didn't notice somewhere in the finishing process. So it's this edge everywhere along the way here. Every one of these edges. And this will take time. This is part, a lot of people that try to rush through and they try to get done in, they set some artificial time limit. They're going to spend an hour or 15 minutes or whatever. And what happens is further on in the finish, you pay. So you have a rough side and a smooth side. Then the last thing is I'll get each open bay. This is just time consuming. I have a little tool for getting in the corners here, the various radiuses I need to get in all the corners and angles. Because even the best finish in the world, if there's a flaw in this woodwork, when you buff it out, you either have to fill it with paint, which is heavy, or when it dries out, it's going to look like that. All of these edges, especially more than anything, the little hinge pockets. That's one thing they'll jump right out at you if they're wrong, they jump right out at you. Hey, it was nice to see Bobby Hunt's going to get himself a expensive motorcycle, but I have to tell you something, boy, they are dangerous. Those bikes are like rocket ships. I've ridden several of them that belong to other people. They've let me test ride them. My friend Frank has one similar to that. You can lose your life on a bike like that. One bad decision. It's not like crashing a plane. See, that's another thing I love about model planes, as opposed to Reno Air Racers. I mean, Gary Levitz lost his life when he crashed Miss Ashley. Some kind of mechanical failure. Well, if I have a mechanical failure, the worst that's going to happen is the balsa distributors of the world are going to get to sell more balsa. Anyway, all these little edges and angles, this all pays. In the long run, when that finish is done, most of it is in the foundation and not in, once it's covered and you have a couple of coats of filler in it, then you can't go back and do this. You've got to do this part of it right now. Back to this wing, because I keep thinking about how much time it took to do this, and in my book, to have the final finish like this, I think that every minute of time was worth it. Look at this. President Nixon's on the phone. President Miss. I was really happy to see and impressed to see Al Rabe is using some molded fiberglass parts on his new Mustang. So what this means is, you know, several other people besides us have been having good luck with this, and it's nice to see that technology is so well accepted now. Because we're still dealing with some really cold, brutal conditions out here, I'm going to put a little bit of retarder in the dope rather than take a chance that I'm not going to get it to lay down nice and smooth because of the viscosity. It's really just to kill the viscosity. Alright, I'm going to lay out the table now. A good trick here is I mix the dope thinner, of course. I put a little retarder in it. It's maybe right now 60% thinner. And the reason for the retarder is I want extra time because I'm going to be here alone. I don't have Mike to help me. So and this is a good exercise in how to do it by yourself. You always have to have the option that nobody's going to be around. And I certainly need to want to get this tissue on today. ST002 GM medium weight silk span. And I'll cut all the sheets to size. I'll see if I can get the tape off the box. Anyway, that Al Rabe tape looks like it's loaded with great little ideas. I'm glad to see he's using some composite parts. Interesting stuff to see everybody has some ideas they can add to our, well, we're not adding to our thing, it's to everybody's thing. Anyway, just to answer a question, a lot of people think they're going to use lightweight silk span to save weight. Forget it. You're going to make twice the work because there's twice as much dope to fill light silk span as medium. Medium will always wind up lighter and better. That's a very common misconception people have about using lightweight tissue, and I have done that test many times. Another thing too is I always want to get the tissue that in the middle it overlaps. So everything underneath the fuselage has 2 layers of tissue. It's a very, very convenient way to stiffen it up. But always good, cut the tissue ahead of time. Don't try to save tissue. Want to make sure all the panels, and this is the most important thing, that they're going to, when I get a full wingtip, that I'm going to go almost to the end here. If I don't get it to come up to here, now the other piece will come over here, so this whole center, it gives it a lot more strength. In my own test, and I don't pretend like this is the only test that ever gets done, but in my own test, when I made the flaps that had the carbon, the light carbon mat, and the silk span, the medium silk span were the more stiff by quite a bit. Now I don't know why, and I don't know if that pertains to everybody, because a lot of people seem to have good luck with that carbon mat, but I haven't. I much prefer silk span to the carbon mat. On the small parts first, I always like to just wet them with Windex. Just touch it with Windex, not soak it. If you get too much on, you can just do this, flip it over to the other side, let it soak in. And notice we're working on a soft pad, so if we do get drips or runs or whatever, it's going to wind up in the pad. Now when the tissue's damp, good tip number 1 is always do a small part first, so you get your hands used to everything. You get to see if the material's too thick, too thin, or if you're going to wind up having a problem. Now you'll know if the material is thin enough or thick enough right on the first pass. This is not really any magic tricks to doing this. When the tissue is just damp, it's very flexible. And a small part like this I can just pat down with the brush. And you can trim this now. But a little easier way is just wait till it dries for 5 minutes, work on another part. Always know you need to get enough material under the tissue. Of course, there has to be some on the dried wood that you've sanded, but I always get a really good coat on there. Don't try to put a real thin coat on there. Now on a bigger part like this, my other technique, and I'll use it on the flaps, is just to use my bare hands to press it down. Pull out the wrinkles, press it down, and since I don't have a helper, I'm going to let it dry and then trim it off. In this cold weather, it may take a half hour to dry. Once I have all the wrinkles out, and a little bit of extra retarder is really helping here because it's going to give me 15-20 minutes of extra drying time. I want plenty of material on it, and I want to press it down with my bare hands. I don't fool around. Bare hands, press it down, get out any air bubbles right around the edges and corners. Once that dries, this will razor right off. Using Windex to wet this rather than water. The Windex doesn't penetrate as quickly. Water tends to penetrate just a little bit more than I like because I have to have one dead bug and it's got to be right in the middle of a flap. Anyway, there's a lot of advantages to working in cold weather. Number one, you're very comfortable. You can tell I'm totally comfortable here. Actually, I don't mind working in the cold for a lot of reasons. Number one, the dope dries with a much better chemical adhesion. Even though you would not want to paint airplanes and cars, and body shop technology would tell you this is not the ideal conditions. These are not ideal conditions, but for our purposes, see, we're not painting cars or airplanes. This is a unique little. The rules a lot of times can be bent to our favor. It really is a help to have a partner, but Mike is out on his snow shoveling operation. And believe me, I'd rather be doing this than working with him today. Okay, there's a little spot where I see I've got a little smoothie there. The first time you lay it all out barehanded like this, whether it's a flap or a wing or leading edge or what, and if you're comfortable with that, if you don't have a bad case of office worker hands or something, well, you find you can get a nice. By the way, the tissue, I think, comes out a lot easier and less prone to wrinkle when it's on damp with Windex than with any other medium, even water. The water seems to penetrate the wood and cause a problem. Now, anytime you do this, this is one of the classic little tricks that a lot of people, it just makes them crazy. You can see this, well, you can't really see it. The flap now has a bow in it. Well, what I want to do is I want to flip this over immediately. I don't want to wait even 2 minutes. You don't want to have it dry one way. You want both sides wet at the same time. The same with a wing. If you covered an outboard wing, you want to do the outboard one side and the top one side, especially on an I-beam wing. Maybe morely on a built-up wing than a foam wing. We don't know if it even matters on a carbon wing yet since we don't have a finish on that. Woody has already finished the body. We're just waiting for a weekend he can come down here and we can assemble a plane. And we'll have a genuine carbon wing test model. Again, some of these things, just the lightest mist on here. Any wrinkles that are in the tissue at this point in time disappear anyway. But always one side and then the other side. Now, by having both sides dry at the same time, and because it's cold, they're going to dry slower, what happens, it's less prone to give you that, where at the end of it, the flap has a bow in it. If you cover one side and go have lunch, come back, cover the other side, or if you spend a lot of time in between, you might run the risk that it's going to warp. And then you get into this endless cycle of bending it and twisting it and steaming it and heating it and whatever. Now your hand pressure pushes down and pushes any extra dope that's been loosened up through the tissue, especially around the edges. Just as insurance, even though I haven't trimmed this yet, as insurance, I re-wet both sides. So both sides are wet at the same time, both sides are dry at the same time. And it doesn't matter, when it lays on here, this is an old bed sheet, and the more wrinkles it has in it, the better. There'll be less points touching. But you don't want to have is a blanket that's prone to pick up fuzz. A bed sheet is about the best I've found. Look at this, the sun is coming out. God.
Wasn't long before the story was relayed to Texas Red.
Anyway, if you keep both of these wet at the same time, same on a wing, you really minimize the chance you're going to get. And these flaps, because this is sea grain, we really have a good chance at having a good pair of flaps here. And once this dries, we'll trim it off. While this is drying out, I'll do the wing. Now, the idea of doing the wing, the objective here is, even though I'm working alone, is get one side done, flip it and get the other side done, and then put it aside to dry for a few minutes, and then do the same thing to the other side. Do one side, immediately flip it over and keep the other side wet. Get no dope out on the edge or on the cap strips, just like a picture frame around the edge only. Here's where having a little bit of extra retarder in the dope is a big help. Because I know, without a helper, this is going to be a little bit of a, not going to get it right on the first shot deal, that's for sure. This is where the extra time, see if you were working against the clock, probably like if you're working in warm weather, by now the dope's already drying. It doesn't give you much time. I'm going to have to cut it around this belt crank now, I can see that. But if you get used to the technique of pressing it down with your bare hand, I think you really can make that work. Now, a lot of people think you got to get tension on this. You really don't. The tissue is going to shrink. And any wrinkles that are still in there, of course, at the end, you can just sand them out. Now, you can get rid of this little piece up here. And this acts as a good pattern. And we can pick this up just a little bit. A double tissue in the center of the wing is, in my estimation, that's the best way to do it. I cannot think of a better way to add a little bit of strength without adding an amount of weight you can't even calculate. Now the extra dope is here just to keep everything wet while I press it down, especially out at the tip here. I'll work the tip a little bit, pull out as many of the wrinkles, even though I don't have to be nervous if one or two of them stay in there. They'll sand right out. I was real happy the way these tips came out. I can't wait to see Walt Russell's big 5.5-inch tips. Wow, that's going to be awesome. See, I've made compromises here to, I love Al Rabe's planes. They're really something special, but what I think is, for me, this is more like what I am comfortable with. And the reason is that it's just more of a standard plane that pretty much anybody can build. In fact, it's probably easier than building an Oval. In fact, I know it is. Anybody that certainly could build an Oval should have no trouble putting a Miss Ashley together, or a Typhoon, or a Strega, or whatever. But I think the day is coming. There's going to be a day, I'll make a prediction, where we're going to have one of the next planes, we're going to try to do something like an Al Rabe plane, where it has dihedral and a lot of other really slick features. That may be coming. What I've done is, before I flip this over, I have the little extra tissue I've trimmed, because I want to have the tissue double on the leading edge. That's a must. Again, any place it's double tissue, you are adding a lot of strength and almost no weight at all. You almost can't measure it on a grain scale unless maybe if you had one of these really super digital scales. You're not adding an amount of weight that would even matter. But that strength, you have people launching a plane, people picking up the plane, all kinds of things happening to that leading edge. That leading edge is taking a beating in the life of the plane. Now the other tissue, when I do this side, I'll wrap it completely around. I'll do the same thing at the trailing edge here. Duplicate it, cut it oversize, and wrap it up. Tissue on here loose. I can slip by the hinge pockets. Because I'm working against time here, I want to get this flipped over and the other side done as soon as possible. This is just I just need to get one side. The other side can just sit. But the first side, whether it's front or back, I want to have double tissue on the trailing edge and on the leading edge. And that allows the tissue to sit right down in those hinge pockets. Have it wrapped around a leading edge, and now when I wrap it around from the other side, the joint will be, I'll have 2 layers of tissue up there. And get rid of a little bit of this extra tissue just to make pulling out the wrinkles easier. Again, I don't really worry about the wrinkles, I just worry about getting the both sides done. And then I'll re-wet both sides. Again, that seems to be the biggest thing to keep it nice. I'm trying to work against the clock here on this. Again, a little more difficult when you're working alone. It's certainly not undoable, that's for sure. I guess you could say the easiest way is to start at one end and just work toward the middle. As long as the dough isn't drying on you, you can just keep pulling it up and repositioning it. You got a wrinkle here. That is just sometimes you're not going to get all the wrinkles out. A big curved tip like this, as long as I get the tissue down, I'm really too nervous about these. These little guys will sand right out. Just to get all the double tissue back around that leading edge. Well, we got it covered. Now the trick is within the next couple of hours, once we know each coat is thoroughly dry, 2-3 hours apart, to get at least 3 coats around the whole perimeter, and then maybe 3 or 4 coats on the whole wing, including all the tissue. And then we'll get back to the shop for the next dust sanding. What I do is I don't even put the lid on the jar. I just leave the lid like this because cleaning the brush just wastes the thinner here. We're going to be putting dope on this on a regular basis. But it usually takes about 3 coats, again, around the perimeter, and then once that's totally dry, then I start doing the open bays. So you can look right through the sheeting on this. This is going to be, hopefully going to be a good wing. And I hope you've picked up some tips or some little ideas that you can use. One tip, try a snowblower. the point where I'm ready to put more dope on this. I have 3 coats on already. It's dried plenty. In fact, it's dried 2 days. What I want to try to do, I do my little test. I take a little sanding block with 320 or 400, it really doesn't matter. Pick a little spot that you want to sand. After 3 coats, it should have enough that you're not going through the tissue. Obviously, you don't want to go through. And you look at the sanding block. First off, you should see is powder. Dope should turn into powder, not into chewing gum. If it turns into powder, this is ready to sand. Now, I used the John Pothier Bud McKnight sanding sticks to get in the hinge pockets. They're fine. Or for doing small edges like this, the little hinge lines, these are so handy. I try to do all the flat areas flat. Now, here's the other thing. As soon as you come up on any tissue at all, you see a few hairs of the tissue, stop. You got to put another coat of dope on. 3 coats is usually the minimum, 5 the maximum. But we had a little extra retarder in here, so the dope went on real thin. So what's happened? There isn't a lot of sanding. I'm trying to do a macro lens so you can see. There's still little pockets, still little places that we're going to need more dope and filler, but the most important thing is all of the edges. And again, powder is, when you're using Brodak dope, and you give it time to dry between coats, you should never see chewing gum on the sandpaper, and that's what makes it easy to get that really nice finish. All of these edges all need to be radius all the edges. When I get to doing the wing, I need to do around all the open bays again. Again, when we put this on, it was really cold, so I gave it an extra day to dry. And if you can put it up by a heating vent for a couple of days, once it gases off, 2 or 3 days in a heating vent, you find out it's powder. And that's what makes building a substrate up real easy. But as soon as you see you might be getting near the end of the tissue, that's when you want to stop. I'm going to have a little imperfection. That DAP vinyl just... While I'm sanding the other parts, I'll let this dry. This will block sand right out. Any little imperfection, or if you... I know what I do is, because I'm clumsy, I put my fingernails into it, or I bang it on something. But we're still at the point, and it's the most important thing to pick up, is do everything with feel, because you'll feel things 100 times faster than you'll see them, even with the best device. So right here is one of the little spots that we did fix already. You can't even feel it now. It's perfect. One of the areas that I'm not going to be using silk span on, tip weight boxes, gear doors, I'm going to cut all the tissue away. Reason is I want to get, first off, coats of dope inside, and I want to keep these edges radius. So important to keep these edges radius. Now I can see from this, I don't have anywhere near enough dope on here. I'm going to need at least 2 or 3 more coats. Because I put it on really thin, had I put it on at a true 50-50, this probably would be enough. I could go to filler coat on the next coat, but I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to put 3 more coats on. But when I put the coats on, first off, I'm going to sand carefully around each edge, each bay, probably taking about 5 minutes a bay, but I'm not going to go out to the very edge. And when I'm all done, I'm going to take a thin brush and just go right around the edges with a thin line to build up a coat of dope that's thicker than the tissue and the wood right on that edge. And that's one of the things I'm going to do as soon as I get enough on the tissue. This really isn't enough. You can feel it from inside even. But very important now, there's places I can use a block, and there's certainly not every, but the flat areas I can use a block. Again, no block up there. See how I'm doing this with the block? I'm not actually sanding. If I go over there, I'll cut through that edge, even though it's radius. I'm staying at least 1/8 of an inch away, because I want to keep extra material right up on that edge. The reason is that edge is going to dive down just a little bit, and I want to let that material between 1/8 of an inch out on the wood and 1/8 of an inch onto the material. I want to build up extra material. But that's the only place on the wing I want this extra material. I don't want 12 extra coats of dope on the wing, or I'm going to wind up with a 50-ounce wing. So by being selective about how I get that extra finish on there, I can keep the wing light and have that nice reflective, smooth quality at the same time. many areas where I have double tissue, and if I put my finger on it, I can feel the step. So as I'm sanding now, I'm going to work those areas carefully with a block. I'll work those areas. I'm not going to get them to go away in one step, but if I do it 3 or 4 times, and the same thing as when I put an edge on here, I'm going to put a little bit extra dope right on that valley, so instead of a step, it starts to blend out. And these are all the little detail steps. Now I'll spend the rest of today sanding this wing out. You can see I'm having no trouble. It's turning to powder. It paid to leave it hanging up by the heating vent that extra day. It looks like the only ripple I have where the sheeting, I sanded it really thin. Right here, I don't know if you can see it, there was a little low spot in the sheeting here that, well, we'll probably fill it with something, but I've sanded the sheeting really a little bit too thin there. But I think that's the only bad spot. We're certainly going to find out right away. But again, the most important part of the whole job is going to be to work on these bays. No sanding of this until we have 3 or 4 more coats. No sanding even of the cap strips because I'm going to be getting too close to that edge. So I'll just sand everything right up to that perimeter and then get 3 more coats of clear on that, on the open bays, and maybe 1 or 2 more on this before we start doing our filler. The wrinkles we had, I guess you can still see part of it. Because the dope is powdering off, the wrinkles really just go away. Again, the biggest thing to remember is to work the edges. It's the edges. Now see, I've just gone through the tissue, so that's the end of this sand out. That needs to get filled before I go. That's as far as I can go, is once I see raw wood, I'm down through the tissue, and those little spots will fill in, but I don't want to go any further. But today, all the dope is drying from the day before, and we're just going to give it an extra day to dry while I work with Mike on his fuselage. Mike's got this cowling making down to a science. What do you figure? What are we going to call you, Cowling Kajeski here? It's laying right in there, nice, huh?
Yeah.
Look at this guy, what a pro. I'm so impressed. Anyway, we already have cowlings made. We got 3 of them made already. But anyway, when they come out, they really do look nice. And we're going to start fitting up his fuselage for the Sato 72 while we give our dope an extra day to dry. It never hurts to have an extra day of dry time. The next thing we're going to do after that dries, another light sanding and maybe 1 or 2 more coats of clear. But always good to let it dry an extra day, that's for sure. So did another thing, and I did this off camera. We're doing laminates now on the shells. This is a shell for a customer that we made with 2 laminates. 2 laminates a 16th with alphatic resin. At one time we did one of these. Some of the glue, actually because the glue was so thin, oozed down and got onto the mold. So now I wrap a sheet of Teflon that's just thin Teflon. I guess you could use wax paper or saran wrap too. When I actually make the mold, and what that does, it protects if any of the alphatic resin does bleed through. We've already got the bandage off of that, and that part's ready to do the final trimming and sanding. And of course, you make a shell like this, you want to do all the sanding right on the mold. So I hope you've enjoyed the tape, and I hope you'll share it with your friends. We're going to pick this up on the next tape with a little bit of work on Mike's fuselage. And every day put a coat or 2 of clear on this. We're light sanding about between every 2 or 3 coats until we build up a nice substrate.